The lead flight attendant snatched my amenity kit in first class, accused me of not belonging here, and told the cabin I might be a trafficker. When I finally said she'd assaulted a federal agent and nearly let a terrorist succeed, she scoffed and said, "You could have just shown your badge." I stayed silent. That was 14 months ago. Last week, she sat in a parole hearing, crying that she'd just been doing her job. I'd been working undercover for 72 hours straight, tracking a credible threat across 3 connecting flights. I looked exactly like what I was pretending to be, an exhausted woman in wrinkled clothes. My unwashed hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and I wore an old college sweatshirt specifically to blend in with economy passengers. What the flight attendants didn't know was that I had a loaded Glock secured under my oversized hoodie and was the only thing standing between them and a suspected terrorist in row 23. The crews on my other flights hadn't given me any trouble, but this one turned out to be a whole different ballgame when the lead flight attendant Violet looked at my boarding pass for first class, then at my appearance, and her smile turned plastic. "Are you sure you're in the right cabin?" she asked loudly enough for other passengers to hear. Sometimes the gate agents make mistakes with upgrades. When I confirmed my seat, she held my boarding pass up to the light like she was checking for counterfeit money. My jaw tightened, but I stayed silent. I needed to maintain my cover without losing sight of my suspect boarding behind me. Violet followed me to my seat and immediately started questioning how I'd gotten the upgrade. Miles? Corporate status? Or did you sweet-talk someone at check-in? Before I could answer, she turned to her colleague Harper and said, "We need to verify this with the gate. She doesn't look like our typical first-class passenger." I sat down and started to pull out the complimentary phone charger when Violet snatched the entire amenity kit away. "Let's wait until we confirm you belong here," she said. "These retail for $200 and we can't have them disappearing." The businessman next to me shifted uncomfortably as she basically accused me of theft in front of everyone. Harper brought pre-flight champagne to every first-class passenger except me, making eye contact as she deliberately skipped my seat. Then she loudly asked the businessman if he wanted to switch seats since he probably wasn't comfortable sitting next to someone who didn't belong there. Violet noticed my worn backpack and pulled it out without asking, claiming it needed to be checked. When I reached for it, panicking because my badge and weapon authorization were hidden inside, she held it away and started going through the external zippers. "What are you hiding?" she asked. "Drugs? Alcohol?" I managed to grab it back, but now she was treating me like a criminal. She called for the male flight attendant and asked him to stand guard near my row because she suspected I might be trafficking something. "Watch her hands at all times," she said loudly. "These people often work in teams." When I shifted to keep eyes on my suspect, Violet announced to the cabin that I was making passengers uncomfortable. She actually asked everyone in first class to raise their hand if they felt unsafe with me there, and when a few people hesitantly did, she used it as justification to call the captain. The captain came out looking annoyed, and Violet immediately painted me as a security threat. She forced her way into first class, won't let go of her bag, keeps watching other passengers, and became aggressive when questioned. The captain, clearly wanting to get back to flying, authorized them to take whatever measures necessary. Harper returned with zip-tie restraints and announced they were detaining me for suspicious behavior. When I kept my arms at my sides, Violet grabbed my wrist and tried to force it behind my back. "Stop resisting," she said loudly, making it sound like I was fighting when I was sitting still. The physical contact made me instinctively pull away, which she immediately called assault. "She's attacking me!" Violet screamed, even though I'd barely moved. "We need backup! This woman is trying to hijack the plane." She pulled the intercom and announced a security emergency to the entire aircraft, sending passengers into panic. People started screaming and crying, thinking they were about to die. Harper tried to tackle me into my seat while Violet attempted to spray me with mace from her vest. I had to duck to avoid being blinded, which would have left the plane defenseless. They interpreted my ducking as an attack posture and started screaming that I was going for a weapon. The male flight attendant grabbed my hair and yanked my head back while Violet tried to force my sweatshirt up to search me. My hand went instinctively to keep my concealed weapon secure, but they thought I was reaching for something. "Weapon! She's going for a weapon!" Harper screamed, even though she couldn't see anything. Violet grabbed the coffee pot and raised it over my head, ready to knock me unconscious. That's when my suspect in row 23 stood up and started moving toward the cockpit, his hand going into his jacket. My body moved on pure training, breaking free and sprinting down the aisle. Violet tried to clothesline me, screaming that I was the terrorist, but I ducked under her arm and tackled the suspect just as he pulled what looked like a detonator. "Federal Air Marshal!" I shouted, my badge finally visible as I pinned him down. "Everyone stay in your seats!" I looked up at Violet, who stood frozen with the coffee pot still raised, her face white as she saw my badge and gun. Harper still had the mace aimed at me, her hand shaking as she realized she'd been about to blind the only person protecting the flight. Full story on the channel below. The detonator felt cold and heavy in my left hand as I kept Ron pinned face down in the aisle. His body tensed under my knee, and I pressed harder into his spine while twisting his arm further behind his back. The entire first-class cabin had gone dead quiet except for crying kids in economy, and the sound of Violet's coffee pot hitting the floor. My badge hung visible now from where my sweatshirt had ridden up during the tackle. Harper's hand shook as she held the mace can, and I barked at her to put it down before someone got hurt. She dropped it like it was burning her fingers and stumbled backward into the galley wall. The male flight attendant stood frozen by the intercom with his mouth hanging open. I told him to announce that federal law enforcement had the situation under control, but his hands shook so bad he dropped the handset twice. Ron suddenly bucked bucked hard underneath me and tried to throw me off by arching his back and twisting sideways. I drove my knee deeper into his spine and heard him grunt as the air rushed out of his lungs. The detonator went into my vest pocket while I used both hands to control his thrashing. He started screaming something about paradise and holy war with spit flying from his mouth onto the carpet. Harper finally brought the zip ties with trembling hands, and I had to talk her through helping me secure his wrists. The captain emerged from the cockpit, and his face went white when he saw me on top of Ron with my gun visible. I identified myself as Federal Air Marshal Morrison and told him we needed to land immediately. He nodded and disappeared back into the cockpit while I maintained my hold on Ron, who'd gone completely limp. Playing dead weight made him harder to control, and I had to shift my position to keep him secure. Violet stood there staring at me like I was the problem, and actually said I could have just shown my badge. My exhaustion and anger broke through as I snapped back about maintaining operational security with an active threat. I told her she'd assaulted a federal agent and nearly let a terrorist attack happen. The businessman from my row had his phone out recording everything, and I realized my undercover career was over. 3 years of building covers and working cases destroyed because Violet couldn't handle someone in wrinkled clothes sitting in first class. The captain's voice came over the intercom announcing our emergency descent into Denver International. Ron started reciting prayers in Arabic under me, and several passengers began crying harder. Someone was throwing up in the lavatory, and I could hear them retching between sobs. A young mother across the aisle clutched her baby to her chest with tears streaming down her face. She kept looking at me, then at Ron, then at the crew, trying to process how close her child had come to dying. The weight of it all pressed down on my shoulders as we descended toward Denver. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, telling everyone to get in brace position for our emergency landing in Denver. I had to keep Ron pinned while also trying to brace myself against the seat in front of me. My arms were shaking from holding him down for so long, and my back felt like it was on fire. The plane started dropping faster, and my stomach lurched. Ron suddenly started laughing under me, this crazy sound that made everyone around us cry harder. He turned his head sideways and said the detonator was fake, just a test to see how bad our security really was. I looked at the device in my hand again, but couldn't tell if he was lying or not. The plastic looked real enough, and the wires seemed connected right, but I wouldn't know for sure until the bomb squad checked it. The plane kept dropping, and the flight attendants were screaming at people to stay braced. My knee was digging into Ron's spine, and my other leg was going numb, but I couldn't move or he might get free. The landing gear dropped with a loud thunk that made several people scream. Through the window, I could see the ground rushing up at us way too fast. The plane hit the runway hard and bounced once before slamming down again. The brakes screamed, and everyone lurched forward in their seats. I nearly lost my grip on Ron, but managed to keep him down by basically laying my whole body across his back. Outside the windows, I could see dozens of flashing lights surrounding us on the tarmac. Red and blue lights everywhere from FBI trucks, Denver police cars, ambulances, fire trucks, and what looked like Homeland Security vehicles. Ron claims the detonator was fake, just a test. That's quite a convenient thing to say after getting tackled by a federal agent. I wonder if he's trying to reduce his charges, or if this really was some kind of security probe gone wrong. The plane finally stopped moving, and immediately I heard banging on the door. The captain opened it, and SWAT guys in full gear rushed in with rifles raised. Two of them pulled Ron up while I briefed their commander about what happened. They dragged Ron toward the front while other officers grabbed Violet and Harper, who were trying to explain that they were just doing their jobs. Violet kept saying I looked suspicious and that she was following protocol. An FBI agent helped me to a seat and started checking my injuries while asking me questions. My arms had dark bruises forming where the crew had grabbed me, and chunks of my hair were missing from when the male attendant yanked my head back. The agent said his name was Thompson and that EMTs were coming to check me properly. I told him I needed to call my husband right away. He handed me his phone while the EMTs looked at my injuries. About 2 hours later, I was in the airport security office talking to my supervisor, Sarah Blackwood, on a secure video call. She looked mad, but not at me. She said 3 years of undercover work were ruined because of a racist flight attendant who couldn't mind her own business. Nathan picked up on the first ring when I finally got to call him from my own phone. I could barely get the words out to tell him I was okay, but stuck in Denver. He said he'd already seen everything because someone on the plane had live-streamed the whole thing, and now my face was all over the news and social media. The FBI techs examined the detonator and confirmed it was real and functional, but Ron hadn't connected it to any actual explosives on the plane. They said he was a known extremist they'd been watching, but hadn't had enough to arrest him until now. He'd been testing our security to find weaknesses for something bigger. The next day, I had to give a formal deposition about everything that happened with the crew. The lawyer's office was full of papers and recordings from the flight. I found out 12 passengers had already filed complaints against the airline for discrimination and endangering everyone. Violet and Harper were suspended while they investigated. The airline's lawyers tried to get me to say the crew was just doing their job and offered me money to keep quiet about the worst parts. I refused and told them on the record that the crew physically assaulted a federal agent and almost let a terrorist complete his mission because they were too busy harassing me. Nathan got to Denver the next morning, and when he walked into my hotel room and saw the dark purple bruises wrapped around both my arms like bracelets and the raw patch on my scalp where chunks of hair had been torn out, his whole body went still. He touched the bruises so gently it barely hurt, and then walked to the window and stood there for 5 full minutes with his fists clenched before turning back to me and saying saying quietly that we were going to sue them into bankruptcy. The FBI had me in meetings all day, but Nathan sat in the lobby working on his laptop and making phone calls to lawyers while I went through every second of the incident again and again with different agents who kept asking if I was sure about the timeline. Day 3, they formally charged Williams with attempted terrorism, and I had to testify before a federal grand jury in a cold room with wood paneling where he sat behind reinforced glass in an orange jumpsuit smirking at me the whole time. And when the guards turned to talk to the prosecutor, he mouthed the words, "Next time," while staring right at me. That night, back in my hotel room, everything crashed down at once, and I started shaking so hard I couldn't stand up, and Nathan had to basically carry me to the bed where I sobbed for 2 hours straight while he held me and didn't say anything because there was nothing to say about how close we'd come to disaster. My phone started blowing up the next morning when passengers from the flight posted their videos online showing Violet yanking my hair and Harper trying to spray me with mace, and within 6 hours the clips had millions of views and the airline's stock dropped 12% in one day. Reporters started calling the hotel asking for comments, and Nathan handled all of them while I sat in the bathtub with the water running because it was the only place that felt safe. Day 5. Violet held a press conference where she claimed she was just following protocol and that I looked like a threat because of my disheveled appearance. But when reporters asked her what specifically made me threatening, she kept stumbling over her words and finally said something about how people who don't usually fly first class act unpredictable, which made everyone in the room go silent. The video of her press conference went even more viral than the attack videos, and by that afternoon, protesters were outside the airline's headquarters with signs about discrimination. Week 2, the Department of Justice announced they were opening a civil rights investigation after finding out Violet had 17 previous complaints from passengers she'd harassed for not looking rich enough, and one former flight attendant came forward saying Violet had a notebook where she rated passengers on whether they belonged in first class. Nathan found me a trauma specialist named Dr. Elena Vasquez who worked with federal agents, and in our first session she explained that my nervous system didn't care that I was trained for dangerous situations because being physically attacked while exhausted and trying to save lives was a perfect recipe for PTSD. Week 3. Williams's lawyer subpoenaed me for his defense, claiming I used excessive force and that the crew's actions proved I must have appeared threatening, and I had to sit through 8 hours of depositions where his lawyer kept trying to make it sound like I was the aggressor, even though the videos clearly showed me sitting still while being attacked. The businessman who'd been sitting next to me, Thomas Wright, sent me an email with his video attached, showing the whole thing from his angle, and you could see clearly that I never raised my voice or made any aggressive moves until the actual terrorist stood up, and he wrote that I saved everyone's lives while the crew tried to stop me, and he'd testify to that in court. Nathan took a leave of absence from his job to stay with me full-time because I wasn't sleeping more than 2 hours a night and couldn't eat without feeling sick, and he handled all the media requests and lawyer meetings and made sure I ate at least something, even when the anxiety made my throat close up. 4 weeks after the incident, Nathan showed me his laptop where Violet was on some conservative talk show wearing way too much makeup and a navy suit that made her look like she was running for office. The host kept asking her why she singled me out when there were 3 other passengers in wrinkled clothes, and she kept dodging the question and saying she was just doing her job to keep everyone safe. Nathan turned it off when she started crying about how her life was ruined because of cancel culture, but 2 days later, Harper's lawyer called to tell me Harper broke down during her deposition. She admitted that before the flight, Violet pulled her aside and told her to watch for certain types trying to sneak into first class, and when the lawyer pressed her, Harper said Violet described people who didn't look like they belonged there. The lawyer recorded the whole thing and sent it to the FAA, who moved fast after that. Within a week, they permanently grounded Violet's flight license and suspended Harper for 6 months, plus the airline got hit with $500,000 fines for each violation of federal security protocols, which added up to millions. Dr. Vasquez started me on something called EMDR therapy the next week, where I had to follow this light bar with my eyes while talking about the trauma. I couldn't even say the words about Violet grabbing my wrist without my whole body shaking, and Dr. Vasquez explained that my body was remembering the helplessness, even if my mind knew it was over. The prosecutor's office called that same day to tell me Ron pleaded not guilty to attempted terrorism, and his trial wouldn't start for 8 months. The prosecutor warned me I'd have to testify and face cross-examination about every single second of what happened on that plane, and just thinking about it made me run to the bathroom to throw up. Nathan held my hair back while I dry heaved over the toilet, and then helped me back to bed where I stayed for the rest of the day. A week later, someone posted our home address on some extremist website, and within hours we were getting death threats from both sides. Some people called me a hero who saved everyone from a terrorist, while others said I was a racist who profiled an innocent Muslim man, and both groups wanted me dead for opposite reasons. The local police said they couldn't provide round-the-clock protection, so we packed what we could fit in the car and moved to a hotel 40 miles away using fake names. The airline's CEO called my lawyer's phone the next morning and asked to speak to me directly. He apologized for about 5 minutes straight and then said to name my price because this never should have happened, and they wanted to make it right. I told him I didn't want money but wanted every single crew member to go through mandatory anti-bias training, so this wouldn't happen to anyone else. He agreed immediately and promised to implement it company-wide within 60 days. That night, Nathan found me at 3 in the morning organizing our hotel closet for the 3rd time that week because I couldn't couldn't sleep and needed to control something. I was checking the door locks every hour and jumping whenever someone walked past our room, and I couldn't be around more than 2 people without feeling like I was suffocating. Nathan tried to get me to come back to bed, but I just sat on the floor folding and refolding the same shirts over and over. The timeline here feels oddly convenient. Ron just happened to have a working detonator but no actual explosives. Why bring a real detonator on a plane if you're only doing reconnaissance? Something about his whole testing security explanation doesn't quite add up to me. My lawyer called the next week to tell me 17 passengers from the flight had joined a class action lawsuit against the airline for emotional distress. Several of them described having nightmares about what could have happened if I hadn't stopped Ron, and one woman said her kids were too scared to fly anymore. Then Harper's lawyer contacted me privately through my lawyer saying Harper wanted to testify against Violet in exchange for leniency on her suspension. She had 2 years worth of recordings on her phone of Violet making comments about passengers based on how they looked and dressed and which ones she thought were trying to scam their way into first class. My lawyer got Harper's recordings within 2 days and sent them straight to the FBI tech team, who ran them through voice analysis software to confirm they were real and hadn't been edited. The tech guy called me that afternoon and said the recordings went back 23 months with over 400 separate incidents caught on Harper's phone. I sat at my kitchen table listening to clips while Nathan made dinner, hearing Violet tell Harper that the black family in row 12 looked like they'd robbed a liquor store to afford their tickets. Another recording had her saying she could smell weed on every Latino passenger and that they were probably smuggling drugs in their carry-ons. She called anyone wearing sweatpants or hoodies economy trash who got lucky and said they should make first-class passengers show their bank statements before boarding. The worst one was from 6 months ago when she told Harper to watch an elderly Sikh man extra close because his turban could be hiding weapons. Harper's voice on the recordings mostly just agreed with everything Violet said, laughing at her comments and adding her own observations about which passengers looked suspicious based on their clothes or skin color. The FBI agent compiling the evidence said it was the clearest pattern of discrimination he'd seen in 20 years of investigating civil rights cases. Week 8 came and Elena called to say she wanted to increase my sessions after reviewing my intake forms and seeing how I kept downplaying what happened to me. I showed up to her office that Tuesday, and she had me sit in a different chair than usual, saying she wanted to try something new. She asked me to close my eyes and walk through the moment Violet grabbed my hair again, but this time to focus on what I felt instead of what I did. My hands started shaking and I couldn't get through describing it without my voice cracking. Elena pointed out that I'd been so focused on protecting everyone else on that plane that I never let myself feel angry about being attacked while doing my job. She said the crew didn't just interfere with my work, they physically assaulted me while I was trying to save 300 lives. I broke down crying for the first time since the incident, finally admitting how scared I'd been that the suspect would detonate while I was being restrained. Elena scheduled me for twice-weekly sessions and prescribed a higher dose of anxiety medication. Sarah called the next morning and asked me to come to headquarters for a meeting about my future with the agency. I knew what was coming before I even sat down in her office. She pulled up news footage on her computer showing my face on every major network, my name trending on social media, and conspiracy theorists making videos about me. She said undercover work requires anonymity, and mine was completely blown. The agency could offer me a desk position reviewing threat assessments or a training role teaching new recruits defensive tactics, but my days in the field were over. I stared at my badge on her desk, remembering all the flights I'd protected without anyone knowing I was there. Sarah said she understood if I needed time to think about it, but we both knew those jobs would feel like punishment after 8 years of active duty. I left her office without giving an answer, and sat in my car in the parking lot for an hour, watching planes take off from the nearby airport and knowing I'd never work on one again. Week 9 brought Wilson's preliminary hearing, and his lawyer tried every angle to get the charges reduced. He argued that my tackling Wilson was excessive force that escalated the situation, claiming the crew's reaction proved that racial profiling was involved in the entire incident. The prosecutor had to carefully explain that the crew's discrimination against me had nothing to do with Wilson's actual attempt to breach the cockpit with what turned out to be a ceramic knife designed to pass through metal detectors. The judge asked to review the flight recordings 3 times, trying to separate the crew's prejudice from my legitimate response to a security threat. Wilson's lawyer kept emphasizing how the chaos created by the crew made it impossible to know who the real threat was, suggesting Wilson was just reacting to the violence he witnessed. The prosecutor showed frame-by-frame video of Wilson pulling the knife before I even moved toward him, proving he was already planning his attack regardless of what the crew did to me. The hearing went on for 6 hours with Wilson's family in the gallery crying every time the video played. That night, I couldn't sleep and went to the bathroom around 2 in the morning. Nathan found me standing at the sink with scissors in my hand, about to cut off all my hair where Violet had grabbed it. Every time I touched that spot on my scalp, I could feel her fingers digging in, yanking my head back while passengers screamed. I told Nathan it kept reminding me of that moment, and I just wanted it gone. He took the scissors from my hand real gentle and pulled me against his chest, holding me while I sobbed about how I couldn't even wash my hair without remembering. He stayed with me in the bathroom until sunrise, telling me we'd find a way through this together. 3 days later, the airline's CEO held a press conference announcing a complete review of their hiring and training procedures. They were bringing in outside consultants to examine how crew members were selected and what kind of diversity training they received. received. The biggest change was a new policy requiring all flight crew to immediately comply when any federal agent identified themselves, with termination for anyone who questioned or delayed response to federal credentials. The Flight Attendants Union released a statement saying the new policy was an overreaction to one isolated incident, but 3 other airlines announced they were implementing similar rules within hours. I watched the CEO read his prepared statement about their commitment to treating all passengers with respect, thinking about how none of this would bring back my career. Week 10 arrived with news that Violet was being formally charged with assault on a federal officer and interference with flight crew duties. The federal prosecutor said she faced up to 20 years in prison if convicted on all counts. Her lawyer held his own press conference saying Violet was being scapegoated for following her training to identify security threats. He claimed she was a dedicated employee with 18 years of service who was just trying to keep passengers safe. The lawyer said they'd prove at trial that Violet had no way of knowing I was a federal agent and was responding to what appeared to be suspicious behavior. He painted her as a hero who tried to stop what she thought was a hijacking, ignoring the recordings of her calling passengers trash based on their appearance. Violet posted bail and immediately went on social media claiming she was the real victim. I had to take a fitness for duty evaluation the next week to see if I could return to any form of service. The psychologist asked me hundreds of questions about my sleep patterns, anxiety levels, and whether I'd had any thoughts of self-harm. I lied about the night with the scissors but told the truth about the nightmares and panic attacks. She had me do reaction time tests and cognitive assessments, then made me describe the incident multiple times while monitoring my heart rate. After 4 hours of testing, she said I showed significant PTSD symptoms and recommended extended medical leave before any return to duty. The report used words like hypervigilance and complex trauma response that made me sound broken. I'd always thought of myself as tough and capable, but now I had a file saying I wasn't fit to serve. Thomas, the businessman who'd been sitting next to me in first class, started emailing me updates about other passengers from the flight. He'd connected with a bunch of them through a Facebook group they'd created to process what happened. Most of them were in therapy, dealing with nightmares about the plane crashing or guilt about not helping me when the crew attacked. A mom traveling with her kids wrote about how her 8-year-old was scared to fly now after seeing the violence. Several passengers were suing the airline for emotional distress, saying they'd been traumatized by thinking they were about to die in a hijacking. Thomas said he'd testified in 3 depositions already, describing how Violet had accused me of theft while I was trying to protect everyone. Week 12 brought the worst news yet when Barnes's extremist group released a statement on their website. They called him a martyr who'd been stopped by an enemy of faith and said I was a symbol of government oppression. The FBI agent assigned to monitor threats showed me posts from their message boards with my personal information and photos of my house from before we'd moved. They'd found Nathan's workplace and were calling him a traitor for being married to me. The FBI increased security around our temporary housing, adding cameras and having agents drive by every few hours. I couldn't go for a run without wondering if someone was watching, couldn't go to the grocery store without checking every face. Harper recorded Violet for almost 2 years without telling anyone. That's hundreds of awful comments she just sat on while pretending to be friends with her. Makes me wonder if Harper was planning to use those recordings for something else before this whole mess gave her a chance to trade them for a lighter punishment. I felt like a prisoner in my own life, punished for doing the job I'd trained for. The news about Ron Barnes came through my phone while I was making breakfast, the notification making my hand freeze over the eggs. His psych eval had been released to the public, and the words on my screen made my stomach turn. The doctor called him competent to stand trial, but said he showed extreme ideological fixation on destroying planes. They'd found his manifesto in his apartment, pages and pages about test runs he'd been planning on different flights. He'd written about studying security patterns, watching air marshals, learning how to spot us by our boarding patterns and seat assignments. The eggs burned while I read about how he'd picked that specific flight because it was full, because the crew seemed distracted, because he thought a morning flight would have sleepy passengers. Dr. Vasquez called me that afternoon for our regular session and noticed my hands shaking worse than usual. She moved her chair closer and started showing me something new, holding up her own hand with 5 fingers spread. 5 things you can see, she said, and I looked around her office and named them. 4 you can hear, and I listened for the clock, the air conditioner, voices in the hallway, cars outside. 3 you can touch, and I felt the leather chair, my jeans, the cold water bottle in my lap. My breathing slowed down and the shaking stopped, at least for a few minutes. She wrote the technique on a card for me to carry, telling me to practice it whenever the panic started. The airline settlement news broke 3 days later during dinner, Nathan's fork stopping halfway to his mouth as the reporter announced $50 million. The money would be split among all the passengers from that flight, with extra going to those who'd been injured in the panic. They also announced new mandatory monthly training for all crew members about discrimination and profiling. The airline CEO stood at a podium reading from cards, saying they had zero tolerance for treating passengers differently based on appearance. I turned off the TV before he could finish his prepared statement about lessons learned and moving forward. The prosecutor called me the next week to tell me Violet's trial was starting and I'd need to testify again. I sat in the back of the courtroom watching Violet take the stand in a conservative black suit, her hair pulled back tight. She spoke softly about protecting passengers, about how scared she'd been, about how my appearance and behavior had seemed threatening. Her lawyer walked her through a sympathetic story about a dedicated flight attendant just trying to keep people safe, but when the prosecutor started cross-examination, Violet's story started falling apart. She couldn't explain why she'd singled me out when there were 3 men in first class wearing wrinkled clothes. She couldn't say why my backpack was suspicious, but the businessman's identical one wasn't. The prosecutor pulled up security footage showing her serving champagne to a man in ripped jeans and a stained shirt 2 rows behind me. Would you have treated a white woman in yoga pants the same way? The prosecutor asked, and the whole courtroom went silent. Violet's mouth opened and closed before she finally whispered yes, but the pause had been too long. I watched the jury members writing in their notebooks, some shaking their heads. Nathan and I couldn't escape the trial coverage that week, every channel running the same clips over and over. We sat on the couch in our temporary apartment eating takeout while pundits argued about whether I was a hero or a troublemaker. One show had a panel debating if the whole thing could have been avoided if I'd just shown my badge earlier. Another had experts discussing whether air marshals should have to identify themselves to crew. I grabbed the remote and turned it all off, too tired to be anyone's symbol or cautionary tale anymore. The verdict came on a Thursday morning, and I watched from the gallery as the jury foreman stood up. Guilty of assault on a federal officer, not guilty of interference with flight crew duties. Violet's legs gave out, and her lawyer had to hold her up as the judge read the potential sentence of 5 to 10 years. She sobbed as the bailiff put handcuffs on her wrists, looking back at her family in the gallery. Her mother was crying too, reaching out like she could somehow pull her daughter back. The judge set sentencing for 6 weeks later and said both sides could submit recommendations. The prosecutor told me afterward she'd push for the maximum 10 years because of the security breach Violet had caused. Violet's lawyer would probably ask for probation, arguing she'd already lost her job, her reputation, her whole life. I nodded and left without saying what I thought about any of it. The FBI finally cleared us to go home after 2 months of hotel rooms and safe houses. I stood at our front door with the key in my hand, almost afraid to turn it. Nathan rubbed my back as I finally pushed it open and walked into our living room. Everything was exactly how we'd left it that morning. I'd gone to the airport for what should have been a routine flight. The coffee mug I'd left by the sink, Nathan's book still open on the side table, mail piled up that the neighbor had been collecting. My legs gave out and I sat on our couch, then laid down and pressed my face into the cushions that smelled like home. I just want our life back, I told Nathan, and he sat beside me and rubbed my shoulders without saying it might never be the same. Ron Barnes's trial was scheduled to start in 2 weeks, and the prosecutor called me in for preparation. She sat across from me with a thick folder, her expression serious as she explained what would happen. His lawyer would try to make me the villain, she warned, would claim I'd escalated the situation with Violet and created the chaos Ron tried to use. She showed me the security footage frame by frame, Ron's hand going into his jacket pocket at the exact moment I broke cover, and I watched myself tackle him just as his fingers closed around the device. The prosecutor said she'd play it in slow motion for the jury, make them see what I saw in that split second, but Ron's lawyer would argue I created the perfect distraction for his client to act. 2 days later, Sarah called me into her office at headquarters, a plain government building with bad fluorescent lighting and metal detectors at every entrance. She pushed a folder across her desk and told me the field work was done for now, maybe forever, but they had another position if I wanted it. Training new air marshals, she said, teaching them how to maintain cover under extreme pressure, using my experience to help the next generation handle situations like mine. It wasn't the job I loved, wasn't protecting flights anymore, but it was something, a way to stay useful instead of sitting at home watching daytime TV. I told her I'd think about it and drove straight to Elena's office, where she had me do breathing exercises while we talked about the offer. Elena said I was making real progress in therapy, but warned me that recovery wasn't a straight line, that I'd have good days where I felt almost normal and bad days where I couldn't leave the house. The bad days didn't erase the progress, though, she reminded me. They were just part of healing from what happened. 3 weeks passed before I called Sarah back and accepted the training position, deciding that teaching others might help me process my own trauma into something useful. My first presentation would be to 50 new recruits about maintaining operational security under assault, and Sarah scheduled it for 2 weeks out to give me time to prepare. The day before that, I had to sit through Violet's sentencing hearing, watching as victim after victim read their impact statements to the court. A mother stood at the podium describing how her 8-year-old daughter still had nightmares about the angry lady who tried to hurt the hero lady on the plane. A businessman talked about missing his father's funeral because he was too scared to fly after witnessing the chaos. An elderly woman explained how she couldn't visit her grandchildren anymore because airports triggered panic attacks. Violet sat at the defense table looking smaller than I remembered, her face going white as she heard how her actions had damaged so many lives. When the judge finally spoke, he called her behavior a serious breach of aviation security that could have resulted in mass casualties if the real threat had succeeded. He sentenced her to 7 years in federal prison with possibility of parole after 4, noting that her discrimination and assault on a federal officer created the exact chaos a terrorist would need. Her family cried in the gallery as guards led her away in handcuffs, her orange jumpsuit replacing the flight attendant uniform she'd worn with such pride. 2 days later, I stood in front of 50 new air marshal recruits in a training room that smelled like coffee and sweat. My voice shook as I started talking about the importance of maintaining cover even when flight crew turned hostile, but as I described the specific techniques for protecting your weapon while being physically assaulted, I saw respect growing in their eyes. They weren't looking at me like a victim, but as an instructor who'd survived the worst-case scenario and could teach them how to handle handle it. Ron's trial started the next week with security unlike anything I'd seen before. Metal detectors at every entrance, bomb-sniffing dogs in the hallways, snipers positioned on nearby rooftops. He pleaded not guilty by reason of religious obligation, claiming his faith required him to act against perceived enemies, but the prosecutor called it what it was: terrorism, plain and simple. When they called me to testify, I had to walk past Ron at the defense table, his eyes following me all the way to the witness stand. Why does Ron's lawyer think blaming everything on that moment when I broke cover makes any sense? He already had the device in his pocket before anything happened with Violet. The security footage shows his hand going for it while she was still just yelling at me. His lawyer immediately attacked my decision-making, arguing that I'd profiled his client based on appearance, that I'd watched him throughout the flight because of his Middle Eastern features. I responded by listing Ron's extremist social media posts, his purchase of bomb-making materials, his connection to known terror cells, all the intelligence that had put him on our watch list before he ever boarded that plane. The lawyer tried to argue that my altercation with Violet created the perfect cover for Ron to pull out what he claimed was a fake device meant only to test airport security. That's when the prosecutor presented the detonator itself, sealed in an evidence bag, and the FBI explosives expert testified that it was fully functional, military-grade, and connected to plastic explosives that Ron had tried to smuggle aboard in a hidden compartment. Several jurors looked at Ron with open disgust as the expert explained how the device would have killed everyone in a 30-foot radius and likely brought down the entire aircraft. During a recess, I was getting water from the fountain when Ron passed by with his guards, and he looked right at me and mouthed the word "soon" before they pulled him away. Security immediately surrounded me, checking for threats, but we all knew what he meant, that even from prison, even if convicted, he'd made sure someone would come for me eventually. I'd be looking over my shoulder for the rest of my life, checking every car that followed too long, every stranger who got too close, living with the permanent fear that his promise would find me when I least expected it. The prosecutor stood up 3 weeks later and started reading from Ron Barnes's journal, each word making my stomach twist tighter. Page after page detailed how he'd been testing airline security for months, booking flights just to see how far he could push before getting caught. He'd watched 14 different air marshals work, studying their patterns and habits, looking for the perfect moment when chaos would give him cover. My flight was supposed to be his breakthrough, the one where he'd finally prove the system was broken. The journal described exactly how he planned to use the crew's discrimination as his distraction, how he'd counted on them focusing on the wrong person while he made his move. He'd written that female marshals were the easiest targets because crews never took them seriously. The prosecutor held up the detonator they'd found, showing the jury how close we'd come to disaster. Security footage from 23 different flights showed Barnes watching, taking notes, testing boundaries. Week 28 brought the verdict, and the jury only needed 3 hours to decide. Barnes sat completely still as they read guilty on all 17 counts of terrorism charges. His eyes locked on mine the whole time, not blinking, not moving, just staring like he was memorizing my face for later. That night, Nathan ordered takeout from our favorite place, and we sat on the couch eating straight from the containers. For the first time since the flight, I actually tasted the food, actually felt hungry, actually smiled when he made a stupid joke about the fortune cookies. The sentencing came 2 weeks after that, and the judge gave Barnes life in federal supermax without any chance of parole. As the guards grabbed his arms to take him away, he twisted around and screamed that his brothers would finish what he started, that I'd never be safe, that they knew where I lived. Security rushed me out through the loading dock while more guards surrounded Barnes, but his voice echoed down the hallway behind us. 8 months after the incident, the airline sent me a formal letter about their new policies and the scholarship fund they'd created in my name for security training. They'd fired 12 employees for discrimination, required monthly bias training for all crew members, and installed new protocols for handling passenger complaints. The scholarship would send 10 people a year through federal security programs. Dr. Vasquez signed my therapy completion certificate after 6 months of twice-weekly sessions. The panic attacks had gone from daily to maybe once a month, and I could sleep 4 hours straight without waking up gasping. She handed me the paper and said I wasn't cured, but I was healing. That trauma like mine didn't disappear but could become manageable. The letter from Harper showed up in my mailbox with no return address. 3 pages of messy handwriting about how Violet had convinced her I was dangerous, how she'd been scared of losing her job if she didn't go along with it. She wrote that she was seeing a therapist too, that she couldn't sleep knowing she'd almost gotten everyone killed by attacking the one person protecting them. I left it on the kitchen counter for 3 days before putting it in a drawer without answering. 10 months after the flight, the Department of Justice released their investigation results showing systematic discrimination across 14 major airlines. They found training videos that taught crew to profile passengers, internal memos encouraging staff to challenge anyone who didn't look rich enough for first class, and complaint files showing thousands of similar incidents. New federal regulations went into effect immediately, requiring anti-bias training every 30 days and creating a passenger rights hotline. Sarah called me to her office for the commendation ceremony, just the 2 of us and a photographer. She pinned the medal on my jacket and called me the best of us, said I'd shown what real courage looked like when everything went wrong. The certificate mentioned extraordinary bravery under assault and maintaining operational security, despite civilian interference. My new training program launched the next month, mandatory for all air marshals nationwide. I taught them how to stay focused when crew members turned hostile, how to maintain cover when being physically attacked, how to protect passengers even when those same passengers were calling you a terrorist. Every class started with a video from my flight, showing exactly how fast things could go wrong and how preparation was the only thing that could save them. 1 year later, on the exact anniversary of the flight, my phone started buzzing with messages from passengers who'd been on that plane. The businessman who'd sat next to me reached out first, then the mother with her kids from row 12, then more and more until we had 17 people in a group chat sharing how that day still haunted them. We started meeting monthly at a community center in Arlington, sitting in a circle like any other support group, except we all shared the same nightmare of watching me get attacked while a real terrorist nearly killed us all. Nathan drove me to every meeting and waited in the parking lot, knowing I needed him close but also needed to face this with the people who'd lived it. We decided to stay in Virginia even though the threats kept coming, even though we'd installed security cameras and changed our routines, because Nathan looked at me one morning and said those exact words about not letting them take our home. That same week, we threw away my birth control pills and started trying for a baby, choosing to build something new instead of hiding from what happened. 3 months later, I boarded my first commercial flight since the incident, just as a regular passenger flying to visit my sister, and my hands shook so bad at security that the TSA agent asked if I was okay. The flight crew on that Southwest flight knew exactly who I was. The gate agent had flagged my booking, and they treated me like glass, checking on me every few minutes and bringing me extra water without me asking. I made it through that 2-hour flight by gripping the armrests and counting my breaths, but I made it, and when I landed, I sat in the airport bathroom and cried from relief. 14 months after the incident, Nathan woke me up at 5 in the morning because breaking news alerts were flooding both our phones about the FBI disrupting a major extremist cell led by someone named Johnson, who'd been planning attacks on federal buildings. The investigation traced back to Ron Barnes, my suspect from row 23, and the intelligence they'd gotten from his devices after I'd stopped him had led them to uncover the whole network. 3 planned bombings had been prevented, hundreds of lives saved, all because I'd maintained my cover long enough to stop him even while Violet was trying to knock me out with a coffee pot. The weight of it hit me so hard I threw up, then sat on the bathroom floor while Nathan held me, and we both processed that my worst day had prevented something so much worse. 2 weeks later, Violet came up for her first parole hearing and got denied flat out, the board citing her complete lack of remorse and her insistence in every interview that she'd just been doing her job. I found out I was pregnant the same day, sitting in Elena's office for our regular session when I mentioned feeling sick, and she handed me a test from her desk drawer saying she'd suspected for weeks. Elena helped me work through the terror of bringing a kid into a world where people like Violet existed, where doing the right thing made you a target, where protecting others could destroy your own life. She reminded me how I'd protected strangers on that plane, people I'd never met before, and asked me to imagine how fierce I'd be protecting my own child. My story became required study at Quantico and every federal law enforcement academy in the country, not as some hero story, but as a case study in maintaining operational security under extreme duress. They showed the video from the plane, analyzed every decision I made, taught new marshals how to stay focused when authority figures turned against them, how one person's bias could compromise national security, how sometimes the people attacking you were the ones you were still sworn to protect. Thomas, the passenger whose teenage daughter had been sitting 3 rows behind Ron, sent me an email with a photo from her college graduation, then another from her wedding 6 months later. Ron keeping a journal documenting months of security testing seems really convenient for the prosecution. I wonder if he actually wanted to get caught at some point. His detailed notes about studying female marshals and using crew discrimination as cover feel almost too perfect for proving premeditation right now. His message was simple, but it broke me completely. Just those words about every milestone she reached existing, because I hadn't let them stop me, because I'd kept fighting even when they were calling me a terrorist. 7 months pregnant, I stood in front of my newest class of federal marshal recruits, no longer hiding the scars on my arms from where Violet had scratched me, or the way my left shoulder still ached from when Harper had tried to pin me down. I told them straight that they'd face discrimination, assault, doubt from the very people they were protecting, that their job was to protect everyone anyway, even the ones attacking them, because that's what made us different from them. They stood and applauded when I finished, and for the first time since that day on the plane, I felt whole again. Like maybe all that pain had led to something that mattered. Like maybe I could teach them to be better prepared than I'd been. Like maybe this was how the story was supposed to end. Alright folks, that's gonna do it for today. Had a great time just wondering about stuff with you. Really interesting hanging out like this. Catch you next time. Subscribe for more content like this.